The crowd had gathered in quiet reverence, their eyes drawn to the motionless figure guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier. The sun glared down on the marble, heat shimmering in the air, but the guard's posture never wavered. His uniform was immaculate, his steps timed with a precision that spoke of something greater than duty. He was a living monument, the embodiment of discipline, respect, and sacrifice. But then, an unexpected disturbance cut through the silence. A man, loud and smirking, broke from the group of tourists. His accent was heavy, his gestures exaggerated. He was Russian, and unlike the others who had bowed their heads in hushed respect, he carried himself with mockery. The man laughed under his breath, shaking his head as though this sacred ritual were nothing more than theater. With every step closer, his amusement grew, and the serenity of the moment cracked. People shifted uncomfortably. Parents placed protective hands on their children's shoulders. Veterans who had come to pay tribute stiffened in anger, their eyes narrowing. Even the young in the crowd sensed the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just a man being rude. This was a man poking at the very heart of tradition, at the living reminder of sacrifice. The guard, however, stood firm. Not a blink, not a twitch. His eyes fixed forward, as though the mocking man before him simply didn't exist. The silence stretched, and in that silence, tension swelled like a storm cloud ready to break. The Russian tourist sneered. He leaned forward, almost as if daring the guard to react. "You think this is power," he said, his words thick with contempt. "You are just a statue in a costume." His laughter carried over the marble courtyard, shattering the reverence that had settled moments before. And yet, the guard did not move. To the onlookers, the contrast was mesmerizing. On one side, arrogance, noise, and disrespect. On the other, unshakable stillness, a silence louder than any shout. The crowd's collective breath hung in the air. Someone whispered, "He's not going to last. He'll have to say something." Another muttered, "Wait, just wait." The world seemed to hold still. Then it happened, the moment that would make headlines across continents. The moment that would remind millions that honor does not bow to insult. The crowd thought the guard would step aside, or finally break his silence. But in the next heartbeat, the world would witness what honor truly means. The silence that wrapped around Arlington National Cemetery was not the silence of emptiness, but of memory. Every name carved into stone carried the weight of a story unfinished, of families broken, of sacrifices made far from home. For the guard who stood watch that day, the marble rows were not just markers. They were reminders of the people he had once stood beside, men who laughed, fought, and bled in places that most tourists would never know. His own story had begun years earlier, when the echoes of war were still fresh in his mind. He had been young then, full of conviction, his chest burning with the belief that service would mean something bigger than himself. That belief was tested when his best friend never returned from a mission they had trained for together. The memory of that loss haunted him still. He carried his friend's dog tag pressed against his chest each day as if silence could keep the promise he once made. "I will not forget you." Becoming a tomb guard was not simply a duty assigned, it was a calling. The training was brutal, demanding more than muscle or stamina. It required perfection, a kind of stillness that was unnatural for most men. Hours upon hours spent learning every step, every turn, every angle until the body became an instrument of precision. He endured it all because he wanted to. Each stride, each crisp motion, was a tribute to those who no longer had a voice. The man who mocked him now could not possibly understand. To the Russian tourist, this was a spectacle, a curiosity to point at. He had arrived that morning loud and brash, speaking to his companions about the weakness of tradition. He had a reputation even among his fellow travelers for being dismissive and arrogant. Where others admired the solemn grounds, he rolled his eyes. He carried himself with the air of someone who believed respect was something given only to power, never to silence. For him, mocking the guard was entertainment. In his mind, a man who stood so still, refusing to break character, was no more than a performer in a uniform. He did not see the weight behind the posture, nor the years of training and sacrifice. He saw a statue to be shaken, a symbol to be broken down into laughter. The crowd was not blind to the setting. Arlington was no ordinary cemetery. It was a place that embodied sacrifice across generations, from wars long past to conflicts still etched into memory. For many, standing there was like standing at the edge of history itself. Children asked questions in hushed voices. Parents struggled to find words. Veterans stood stiff-backed, their eyes fixed forward, remembering brothers and sisters who never came home. This contrast. One man sneering against a field of memory was what gave the moment its charge. The air felt heavy, the kind of heavy that makes even the wind seem respectful. Yet within that heaviness was a brewing storm, because disrespect in such a place does not merely fall flat. It cuts, it bruises, it enrages. The guard had learned to control every outward sign of emotion, but inside him, the memory of his friend burned. He remembered the night of the ambush, the sound of gunfire tearing through the dark, the desperate calls on the radio that never received a reply. He remembered holding his friend's belongings, numb, unable to understand how someone so alive could suddenly be gone. Those memories shaped the reason he never flinched now. To him, silence was not weakness, it was strength, a vow, a shield against forgetting. The Russian tourist's arrogance was amplified by the reactions of those around him. A mother pulled her young son closer, whispering, "Don't laugh. This place is not for jokes." An old man wearing a veteran's cap clenched his jaw, his knuckles whitening as his fists tightened. Even the journalists in the crowd adjusted their cameras, sensing a story unfolding before their eyes, unsure of how it might end but unwilling to look away. Every step the tourist took closer to the guard seemed like a violation, an intrusion into a space where thousands had laid down their lives. He laughed, mimicking the guard's rigid stance, puffing out his chest, pretending to march. His voice rang out, dismissing what he called the American show of respect. But if he thought his mockery would draw a reaction, he underestimated the depth of the silence before him. For the guard, that silence was sacred. He had been taught that even when jeered at, even when insulted, he was not standing as an individual but as the embodiment of all who had fallen. His role was not to fight back but to represent something unbreakable. That knowledge weighed heavily on his shoulders, yet it steadied him too. No insult, no shove, no laugh could strip away what he represented. The setting amplified everything. The white stone, the trimmed lawns, the hushed crowd. It was as though the ground itself demanded reverence. Every eye shifted between the guard and the intruding tourist. It was no longer just one man mocking another. It had become a confrontation between arrogance and honor, between fleeting noise and eternal silence. As the Russian tourist smirked and crossed his arm, daring the guard to react, no one could yet know the moment was building toward something unforgettable. The air was tightening, the lines being drawn not with weapons, but with presence. And all the while, the guard did what he had sworn to do, stand unmoved, silent, and resolute. The Russian tourist's smirk grew wider as he took deliberate, mocking steps toward the guard. Each movement seemed rehearsed for the amusement of his companions, a crude performance meant to humiliate the man who dared to stand unmoved. He swung his arms theatrically, imitating the guard's disciplined march, and added exaggerated salutes that were more laugh than respect. His voice carried across the courtyard, a grating contrast to the solemnity of Arlington's marble rows. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. A little boy clutched his mother's hand, eyes wide, sensing both the tension and the sacredness of the moment. The mother whispered softly, urging silence, but even her voice seemed swallowed by the sheer audacity of the tourist. Veterans in the crowd shifted their weight, fists tightening, jaws set, while others murmured quietly, words laced with disbelief and restrained anger. Cameras clicked and recorded, capturing a spectacle no one had expected. A confrontation that felt as old as time, honor against arrogance. The guard remained immobile, not a blink, not a twitch. His posture was perfect, a silent defiance that communicated far more than any shouted warning ever could. He had trained for this, yes, but more importantly, he had lived through it. Every insult, every laugh, every mocking gesture ricocheted in the air, but none reached the core of him. He was anchored by years of discipline, by memories of the fallen, and by the knowledge that his stillness was a statement louder than any scream. The tourist, growing impatient with the lack of response, took the next step. He leaned closer, jabbing a finger toward the guard's chest as if to poke at the immovable man. "Do you even hear me?" he jeered, his accent thick but his intention unmistakable. "You're just a puppet in a costume. Move, react." His companions laughed nervously, unsure if the mockery would provoke violence or if this was some kind of ritual the American guards performed for tourists. The crowd's reaction intensified. A group of veterans whispered under their breath, eyes never leaving the scene. "He's testing him. That's disrespect," one said. "Do not touch him," warned another. Mothers and children murmured anxiously, holding each other closer. Even the journalists, cameras trained, could sense the escalating tension. Every second stretched longer, each heartbeat heavier. The tourist's audacity seemed to defy not just tradition, but a deeply ingrained understanding of respect and history. And yet, the guard remained. His eyes did not waver from forward, yet the subtle tightening of his jaw spoke of readiness. Inside, he catalogued every movement, every breath, every flicker of expression from the man daring to challenge centuries of honor. His mind replayed the faces of friends he had lost, the soldiers who had fought beside him, the civilians he could not save. Each memory fortified his resolve. He understood fully that his response, if given too soon, could escalate into chaos. Silence, patience, and discipline were his weapons. The tourist, frustrated by the lack of immediate reaction, began to escalate. He stomped near the guard's boots, laughing as if the polished shoes were fragile, breakable. He imitated exaggerated marching, tilting his head in mock respect, smirking at those who stood around him. The murmurs of the crowd became more pronounced. Children gasped softly. Veterans gritted their teeth. The air was thick with tension, the kind of tension that made even the sunlight feel heavier at one point. The man reached out, brushing the guard's arm lightly, expecting perhaps a flinch, a turn, or even a word. But the guard's response was nothing outwardly dramatic. His arm remained steady, his posture perfect, yet the small, imperceptible shift of his rifle grip was enough to send a message. He was ready. Unwavering, fully in control. The silence around him became a force of its own, a pressure that made the tourist hesitate, if only for a heartbeat. Whispers grew among the crowd. "He's not moving, he's not reacting." Someone said, "How can anyone stand like that?" A journalist murmured, "This is going to be a viral moment. People need to see this." A veteran nodded grimly, recognizing the discipline in the stance. "He's showing them what respect truly is." The tourist, sensing the rising attention, became louder, trying to force a reaction through sheer volume. He mimicked the guard's precise movements, shouting mock orders to an invisible squad. He gestured as though conducting a parade, his voice echoing across the cemetery. Some children began to cry softly, overwhelmed by the tension and the palpable seriousness of the situation. Parents hurriedly tried to console them, but there was a lesson unfolding that even they could not interrupt. The guard's silence was deafening. It drew the eyes of every spectator and anchored them in awe. There was no reaction, no anger, no step forward, only discipline, measured and precise. Every breath he took seemed calculated, every shift imperceptible, yet imbued with authority. The contrast between the tourist's chaos and the guard's unwavering poise was almost cinematic, as though the moment had been paused, the world holding its breath. The Russian's smirk faltered. He began to sense that this was not an ordinary man, not someone who could be shaken by noise or mockery. His arrogance wavered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Yet he pushed on, raising his voice, waving his arms, laughing even louder, trying to dominate the space by sheer audacity. But the crowd was no longer passive. Whispers turned into murmurs of respect, mixed with tension. Veterans straightened. Parents pulled children back, urging them to watch, to learn. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion, every imperceptible motion. Every sign that this was more than a confrontation, it was a lesson in honor and restraint. The guard's gaze remained forward, unbroken. His stillness was not just resistance, it was a mirror reflecting every insult, every mockery, every laugh back to the man who sought to disrupt sacred tradition. And the longer he stood, the more it became clear, this was no ordinary confrontation. This was a test of character, a silent reckoning, and the world was watching. The Russian tourist, sensing his mockery was no longer drawing the reaction he expected, grew bolder and reckless. His laughter turned sharp, almost challenging, as if daring the guard to break the stillness he had held for so long. He leaned closer than anyone should have dared, a smirk curling across his face. The crowd tensed, sensing the invisible line being crossed. Children huddled behind parents, eyes wide, while veterans' hands curled into fists, knuckles whitening. Reporters instinctively raised their cameras, capturing every heartbeat of the unfolding drama. The man's arrogance escalated into provocation. He jabbed a finger toward the guard's chest, inches from the rigid uniform, as though he could poke at honor itself and fracture it. "Do you even know what respect means?" he jeered, voice booming and disrespectful. The guard did not flinch. His breathing was measured, his eyes locked forward. He was a wall, unyielding, immovable. The silence around him grew thicker, like a living force pressing against the insolence before him. The tourist took another step forward, his foot brushing dangerously close to the white line of sacred ground. With that motion, the tension snapped in the crowd. Whispers escalated into murmurs of disbelief and A mother pulled her son back sharply, whispering warnings that went unheard. A veteran muttered under his breath, teeth gritted, "Don't touch him, just don't." But the tourist didn't stop. He reached out, as if to shove the guard lightly, fully expecting the man to flinch, to react. To crack. It was the moment that would define the day. The guard's response, when it came, was almost imperceptible, a precision honed by countless hours of training, by discipline refined into art. His rifle shifted ever so slightly, steel gleaming in the sunlight, a subtle warning that spoke louder than words. The tourist, expecting either retreat or outrage, faltered. The hint of readiness in the guard's stance was enough to send a flicker of uncertainty through the arrogant man. Time seemed to slow. The crowd inhaled collectively, the air thick with anticipation. Every whisper, every step, every heartbeat felt amplified. The Russian tourists who had mocked without hesitation moments ago now hesitated, sensing an authority beyond comprehension. The guard's stillness was no longer passive. It was a presence, an unspoken declaration. You are out of your depth then. In the blink of an eye, the guard executed a movement so precise, so controlled, that it left everyone frozen. The rifle, once resting silently at his side, snapped into position with a sharp authoritative click. His stance shifted subtly, but the change was enough to convey readiness, discipline, and the unshakable will of someone who had dedicated his life to honor. The tourist recoiled, eyes wide, the smirk gone, replaced by shock. The crowd gasped as one. Cameras flashed, capturing the tension, the fear, the realization that this man was not to be trifled with. Parents held their children tighter, veterans straightened, some nodding subtly in recognition of the display. Even the journalists, trained to remain neutral, felt the gravity of what they were witnessing. "What are you doing?" the Russian stammered, backing up instinctively. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by unease. For the first time, he understood that he was not facing a mere man in a uniform. He was confronting a symbol, a living embodiment of discipline, memory, and respect. The guard's eyes never wavered. The rifle remained poised, his posture flawless. The silence returned, but now it was charged, potent, almost tactile. It pressed against the tourist like the weight of history itself. Every mocking word, every laugh, every gesture that had dared to challenge him now hung suspended, impotent against the immovable force of unwavering honor. The crowd, sensing the shift, held its collective breath. The moment had transformed. No longer was this simply a confrontation between a brash tourist and a soldier. It had become a lesson, a demonstration of restraint over chaos, of discipline over arrogance. The whispers spread through the spectators. This is courage. This is strength. This is honor. The Russian tourist stumbled backward, a flush of fear coloring his face. His companions murmured warnings, urging him to step away, but he was frozen in disbelief. He had mocked tradition without consequence until now. Now he faced a presence that demanded recognition, respect, and humility whether he wanted it or not. In that moment, the guard's unshakable discipline won silently but decisively. No words were spoken. No fists were thrown. Yet every person watching understood the truth. Arrogance could not prevail against honor. The tourist had tested the line, and it had held. Even as security began to approach, called by onlookers sensing escalation, the guard did not move. His post remained intact, his gaze fixed forward, a quiet sentinel standing guard over not only the tomb but the principle it represented. The tension began to ebb, replaced by awe. The crowd exhaled, some trembling, some nodding with respect. Children whispered to parents, "He's a hero." Veterans exchanged knowing glances, silently acknowledging a lesson learned without a single word. And though the confrontation seemed to conclude in mere moments, its impact would ripple far beyond Arlington. Cameras captured every second, and soon the world would witness what silence and stillness could achieve when paired with unwavering resolve. The guard had proven something universal, that discipline is not passive, that honor is not fragile, and that sometimes the most powerful actions are the ones left unspoken. The Russian tourist's bravado had completely evaporated. He stumbled back, his earlier laughter replaced by an expression of shock and fear. His companions hovered, unsure whether to intervene or flee, their voices quiet now, tinged with apprehension. The crowd held its collective breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone like a living thing. Cameras clicked frantically, capturing each nuance of what was unfolding, a moment that would soon be shared across continents. Security personnel, alerted by the escalating tension, advanced cautiously toward the intruder. Their presence, though commanding, was almost secondary to the silent authority of the guard. No one dared interrupt his stance. No one could match the quiet power emanating from the man who had held the line without uttering a word. The guard remained perfectly still, his eyes forward, rifle poised with precision, embodying discipline itself. The tourist, now realizing he had miscalculated entirely, attempted a hurried retreat. His steps were unsteady, uncertain, betraying the arrogance that had carried him this far. But the invisible lesson had already been delivered. Every mocking gesture, every laugh that had once filled the air with disrespect, now hung awkwardly in the space. Exposed and powerless against the unwavering honor before him, security reached the man just as he tried to regain composure. Officers guided him away firmly but carefully, ensuring no escalation occurred. The crowd watched silently, some whispering praise, some nodding in relief, and some still trembling from the intensity of the confrontation. The tourist was removed, but the energy in the air did not dissipate. Something more profound had occurred. All eyes returned to the guard. He did not move. He did not lower his rifle. He did not flinch. In his stillness lay the undeniable message. Chaos could never conquer discipline. Mockery could never triumph over honor. The crowd erupted, softly at first, then with growing applause and murmurs of admiration. Parents pointed to their children, whispering, "Look closely. This is courage." Veterans exchanged knowing glances, silently acknowledging the weight of what had just transpired. A journalist stepped forward, camera trained, and whispered to a colleague, "This is going to go viral. People need to see this." It was true, the footage would travel the world, a testament to the power of restraint and the strength of unwavering resolve. The guard remained motionless, yet his impact was undeniable. Every person present had witnessed something rare and profound, the triumph of discipline over provocation, of respect over arrogance. The moment reached its pinnacle when the guard, still unshaken, executed the final ceremonial step in his rotation. Every movement, deliberate and precise, resonated with symbolism. It was as if he were silently telling the world that while the tourist's disruption had been fleeting, the principles he protected were eternal. The crowd gasped again, some instinctively reaching for cameras, others simply watching in awe. For the Russian tourist, the humiliation was complete. He had entered the scene with arrogance, expecting to dominate, to ridicule, and to entertain himself. Instead, he had been exposed, humiliated, and quietly restrained by the invisible force of integrity. Security escorted him away, his face pale, his smirk gone, replaced by an understanding of respect he had never before considered. The guard, having faced the test without faltering, resumed his post with the same quiet dignity that had defined him from the beginning. Every step, every pause, every shift of the rifle was executed flawlessly. The crowd's whispers evolved into off-field conversation, parents explaining to children that some battles are won not with words or weapons, but with stillness, with presence, with honor. As the last echoes of tension faded, the impact of the moment began to settle into memory. It was no longer just a confrontation between one man and another. It was a story of principle, of discipline, of unwavering respect that transcended nationality, language, or intention. The world had witnessed something extraordinary, a single individual standing firm in the face of provocation, a living example of what it means to uphold honor without compromise. The guard's calm demeanor, his silent defiance, and the ultimate humiliation of the tourist created a viral moment destined to be remembered. Social media would later echo the sentiment of those who had been present, that sometimes, the most powerful victories are won not through confrontation, but through unyielding stillness, an unspoken testament to the strength of integrity. And as the sun glinted off the polished brass of his rifle, the guard stood, immovable and resolute, the living embodiment of a truth that would resonate far beyond the gates of Arlington. Discipline endures where arrogance falters, and honor prevails where chaos seeks dominion. The Russian tourist was gone, escorted away by security, leaving behind an awkward silence that soon gave way to reverent murmurs. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but their whispers carried admiration, respect, and awe. Some parents lifted their children, pointing discreetly toward the guard, explaining quietly, "This is what courage looks like." Veterans nodded to one another, eyes gleaming with recognition, silently acknowledging the unspoken lesson they had all just witnessed. For the guard, the moment was already behind him. He remained on post, every movement precise, every step deliberate, as if nothing had occurred. Yet internally he allowed himself a fleeting moment of reflection. He reached subtly for the dog tag he carried beneath his uniform, a small, cold piece of metal that bore the memory of a friend lost long ago. The same friend who had taught him, in a different war and a different time, that courage was not measured by noise or bravado, but by the steadfastness of the heart. A child, having lingered behind his parents, whispered softly to a nearby veteran, "He's a hero." The words, so small and innocent, reached a guard in an almost imperceptible way. He allowed the corners of his mouth to tighten just slightly, a subtle acknowledgement, though no one could see it under the brim of his cap. Even amidst the weight of public attention, the guard's honor was not for accolades. It was for those who could not speak for themselves, for those who had given everything and returned nothing, and for the principles that could not be broken by arrogance. The colonel overseeing the ceremony approached quietly, his boots making soft, measured steps on the stone walkway. He stopped a respectful distance away, saluted crisply, and held it just long enough for the guard to acknowledge. There was no fanfare, no applause, but in that exchange lay a mutual understanding that transcended words. Discipline had been tested, integrity had prevailed, and the message was clear. The guard had upheld more than a tradition, he had upheld a standard, unshaken by mockery or threat. Alone for a brief moment, after the crowd had thinned and the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the guard allowed himself another subtle reflection. He ran his fingers along the dog tag again, feeling the cold metal and remembering the fallen friend who had once inspired him. The medals pinned to his chest glinted faintly in the last rays of sunlight, but they were not the focus. The true recognition was in the quiet satisfaction of having remained unwavering, of having honored the memory of those who could not defend themselves, and of having demonstrated to the world that strength need not be loud to be undeniable. He allowed his gaze to wander over the rows of white marble, each marker a reminder of lives given and lessons learned. Arlington was not just a cemetery, it was a living testament to courage, sacrifice, and unspoken heroism. Today, one more chapter had been added, a moment captured not by war but by stillness. The crowd had seen it, cameras had recorded it, and the story would travel far. But for the guard, the act itself was enough. Recognition, applause, and viral attention were secondary to the principle that had guided him for years. The child's soft words echoed again in his mind. Hero. Perhaps the guard would never see that child again, and perhaps the world would remember him in fleeting viral snippets, but the meaning remained the same. Heroism, he reflected, was not about seeking fame or acknowledgement. It was about standing firm in the face of provocation, maintaining discipline when chaos threatened to overtake, and honoring those who had sacrificed everything. As he resumed his steady rotation along the tomb, each step measured, each pause exact, he carried with him a quiet satisfaction. Arlington's silence enveloped him once more, but it was no longer oppressive, it was comforting, filled with purpose, and resonant with the echoes of those who had walked before him. In the end, the lesson was simple yet profound. True strength is calm, unwavering, and silently absolute. The crowd had dispersed, leaving behind the quiet dignity of Arlington. The air was thick with the weight of what had transpired, a lesson witnessed by hundreds, recorded by dozens, and soon to be shared with the world. The Russian tourist was gone, his arrogance replaced by the memory of a disciplined stare, a lesson he would not soon forget. But the guard remained steadfast, silent, a living testament to the power of restraint and honor. In the fading sunlight, he adjusted his uniform, every fold and crease a mark of meticulous care, every movement deliberate. There was no pride in his demeanor, no desire for applause. He did not seek recognition. The strength he carried was quiet, unshakable, and invisible to those who only looked for noise. It was a strength forged in loss, in sacrifice, and in a commitment to principles far larger than any one man. A child, eyes wide with wonder, pointed toward him and whispered to a parent, "He's a hero." The words, so simple, cut through the ordinary chatter of life outside the cemetery gates. The parent nodded, squeezing the child's hand. The guard, sensing the small acknowledgement, allowed himself a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was not for fame. It was not for the viral videos or the attention. It was for something far older, far more enduring. The recognition that honor cannot be mocked, that discipline cannot be broken, and that silence when held with purpose is louder than any shout. The colonel approached again, this time in a slow, measured walk, stopping just short of the guard's position. He saluted with crisp precision, a quiet acknowledgement of the perfection, restraint, and courage he had just witnessed. The guard returned the salute, eyes forward, posture unyielding. No words were exchanged. They did not need to be. In that exchange, the principles of service, duty, and honor were reinforced. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the white marble, the guard's thoughts drifted back to the friend he had lost, the dog tag he carried, the lessons learned in blood and sacrifice. Every action that day, every second of unflinching stillness, was for them, for the memory of those who could not speak, and for the message that would echo far beyond Arlington's gates. He had been tested, and he had not wavered. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Tradition is not weakness. Silence is not emptiness. Discipline, honor, and restraint are far stronger than arrogance, noise, or chaos. The world had watched, the crowd had witnessed, and the story would be told not just of a confrontation, but of a principle that endures. He adjusted his rifle one last time and began his steady rotation. Each step precise, each pause deliberate, the embodiment of calm authority. The viral moments would fade, the news cycles would turn, and the Russian tourist would leave with a memory he would never shake. But the guard's presence, unwavering and resolute, would remain timeless, a silent sentinel reminding the world of what true honor looks like. And in that quiet, Arlington itself seemed to whisper, respect is not demanded, it is earned. Discipline is not forced, it is lived, and the world, if only it paused to watch, could learn from the stillness of a man who stood immovable, a hero without words, a guardian of memory, and a master of silent strength.